John Harris always considered himself a strong, independent person. He grew up in a small town where prejudices and stereotypes were part of everyday life. "I know how the world works," he thought as he walked past groups of people he had formed opinions about as a child. But that day, everything changed. The sunlight was shining brightly on his sports car as he drove out of town, hoping to escape the routine of his life. However, as soon as he turned onto a narrow road, the engine creaked and gave up. John slammed the steering wheel in anger, realizing that he was now stuck in this godforsaken place. Surrounded by tall trees and abandoned buildings, John felt a chill run down his spine. He tried to call a tow truck, but the connection kept dropping. "What the hell?" he cursed, his heart pounding with anger and fear. There was no one around, and his preconceptions no longer seemed so important. When John got out of the car to look around, the air became thick and oppressive. He peered into the darkness, where only the silhouettes of buildings were, and suddenly noticed someone approaching. Fear gripped him. "Who is it?" he thought as he took a step back. The feeling of danger was overwhelming him. He remembered the stories of bandits and criminals that his father had told him when John was still a teenager. The figure approached, and he clenched his fists. It was a black man, looking confident and calm. His face was determined, but John couldn't shake off his preconceived thoughts. It was as if he had a habitual reaction on his tongue. "What does he want from me?" Michael, that was the man's name, looked at John with interest. He stopped a few steps away and assessed the situation. John felt his heart beat faster. Questions flashed through his head. What if he's dangerous? What if I should leave? But as John leaned against the door of his car, he knew he had no choice. He could either stay here and wait for the unknown, or he could try to talk. Fear and pride warred in his soul, but he knew that if he didn't ask for help, he could end up in a much more dangerous situation. "I need help," he finally managed to say, his voice shaking. He was about to say more, but suddenly his words caught in his throat. The situation was tense, and John felt fear creeping up on him again. At that moment, he realized that his prejudices and stereotypes could play a cruel joke on him. What would happen next? Would John stick to his beliefs, or would he be able to change his view of the world? These questions plagued him as he stood there, waiting to see what would happen next. Enjoy watching. John Murphy always felt entitled to say and do whatever he wanted. He grew up in a small town where prejudice was the norm. His childhood friend, Bob, often joked that people shouldn't mix with people like them. It was one of those sayings that John remembered and carried with him as an integral part of his identity. One evening, as John was driving home from work, his car stalled on a deserted road surrounded by woods. He had chosen this route to avoid traffic, but now he knew it had been a terrible idea. There was no one around, and the evening air was thick with tension and foreboding. He got out of the car, reaching for his phone, only to find that the signal had disappeared. "Great," he muttered, slapping the steering wheel in frustration. John walked down the road, hoping to catch a ride. Suddenly, a noise came from the woods that made him freeze. He turned his head and saw a group of men emerging from the shadows of the trees. "Hey, man, what are you doing here?" one of them shouted, his voice sounding threatening. John swallowed and tried to remain calm. "My car broke down. I'm just waiting for help." The men exchanged glances, and John felt his heart beat faster. These were people he had always considered different. He saw wariness and even hatred in their eyes. "Oh, we have a real hero here," one of them said with a grin. "How did you even get here?" John raised his head sharply. "I was just waiting for help. No need to make anything up. You know, this isn't a very welcoming place," the other man continued, approaching, "especially for someone like you." John felt his pride begin to crack at the seams. "I don't know what you're talking about. Get away from me." The men began to laugh, and the laughter sounded like a harbinger of trouble. "And you're impudent too. Do you like being like you?" said the third, his voice full of contempt. "I didn't do anything wrong," John said, trying to suppress his fear. He knew he needed to find a way to leave this place. Suddenly, he saw one of the men take out a phone and point the camera at him. "We'll remember you, kid." John took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to run. "Look, I really need help. You know, we have our own ways of solving such problems," said the first man, and his voice became sullen. John's heart was pounding, and he felt the ground slipping from under his feet. The situation was getting worse, and now he realized that he was not only alone, but also in mortal danger. Suddenly his eyes fell on a group of trees. He could try to escape. "I'm not staying here," he shouted, turning sharply and running headlong into the forest. But the men rushed after him, their laughter and shouts mingling with the dull noise of the forest. "Run, boy!" one of them shouted. "We'll catch you." John didn't know where to run. Anxiety washed over him and he felt his legs refusing to obey him. Suddenly he tripped over a tree root and fell to the ground, breathing heavily. Voices came from the trees. "Where are you, idiot?" came the voice, full of hatred. He rose to his feet and ran deeper into the forest, but panic gripped him. "This can't be happening to me," he thought, his fear growing more and more overwhelming. "I have to get out of here." Darkness surrounded him, and every rustle seemed to be a harbinger of trouble. John understood that this night could be his last. John felt fear creeping up on him as he ran through the forest. Every rustle, every crack of branches underfoot made his heart beat faster. He didn't know where he was running, but his instinct for self-preservation told him not to look back. He looked for some kind of shelter, but the forest seemed endless. Suddenly he came upon a narrow path that led deep into the trees. John turned onto it, hoping that it would lead him to the exit. However, the feeling of being chased did not leave him. The shouts of men and their laughter were still heard in the distance. "You can't hide, boy," one of them said, and John felt panic rising in him. He stopped abruptly and pressed himself against a tree, trying to catch his breath. For a moment there was silence, but soon he heard footsteps approaching him. John knew he had to act. If he couldn't get out, this could be his last day. Taking a deep breath, he rose and began to run again. Suddenly the path ended and he found himself at the edge of a cliff. Below him was a river, seething and fierce, with cliffs rising on either side. John felt terror creeping up on him. "Where are you?" one of the men shouted, his voice so close that John felt his knees buckle. He looked back and saw silhouettes approaching him. "You can't run away from us," laughed the other. "We know where you are." The thought flashed through his mind that he had no choice. He could try jumping down into the river, but that was risky. The water could carry him away, or worse, smash him against the rocks. But staying here meant certain reprisals. "I'm not afraid of you," he shouted, though his voice shook with fear. It was more for him than for them. He tried to convince himself that he shouldn't give up. "Are we afraid of you?" one of the men replied, crawling out of the shadows of the trees. His face was distorted by an evil smile. "You chose this path yourself, boy." John took a step back, his back against the tree trunk. He tried to find strength, but a voice inside him whispered that he couldn't handle this situation. Suddenly he remembered his earlier words about people like them and realized that he was now in their situation alone, scared and helpless. "What do you want from me?" he asked in despair. "I haven't done anything to you." "You didn't think you'd go back on your word that easily, did you?" one of the men said, coming closer. There was a malicious pleasure in his eyes. "We want you to learn to respect." John felt his fear turn to despair. He didn't know how to get out of this situation, and he knew that every second was building up tension. Like a spring about to snap, he had to do something. "Please, let me go." There was a sincere note in his voice. "I will change. I will be different." But the men's laughter only grew louder. "That's funny coming from you," one of them shouted. "We can't let people like you just go away." John knew that time was running out and his chances of survival were rapidly diminishing. He clenched his fists and, gathering all his strength, at the last moment he turned and threw himself towards the cliff, straight into the turbulent water of the river. The strong current carried him down, and he did not know what awaited him ahead. In the water he felt his body being lifted and thrown, and images of his life, his prejudices and beliefs that now seemed so distant to him, flashed through his mind. What will happen next? How will he be able to get out of this situation? And will he be able to realize that his views were wrong? This was only the beginning of his internal struggle, and the most difficult tests were waiting for him ahead. The water immediately swallowed John up, and he found himself in an underwater darkness of confusion and chaos. The river current swirled him around like a rag doll, and he couldn't tell which way was up or which was down. Fear gripped him as he realized he might not make it out. Thoughts of his own biases, of how he had spent his life judging people by their appearances, flashed through his mind, but it didn't matter now. His life was in danger. Finally, he broke the surface, gasping and gasping for air. His body was shaking from the cold, and he felt the river carrying him away into the unknown. He began to paddle, struggling to get to the shore, but his strength was fading. "Hey, he's here!" one of the men suddenly shouted, appearing at the edge of the cliff where John had just jumped. They weren't leaving him alone. Their faces were twisted into malicious grins, and he felt his insides clench. John finally reached the shore, but his strength was gone. He fell to the ground, trying to catch his breath, and looked around for cover, but the men were closer than he expected. He recognized one of them as the one who had first begun the pursuit. "What? Are you scared?" he said mockingly. "We won't let you leave just like that." Suddenly others came towards him. They surrounded him, and John felt panic rising in him. He got to his feet, but he didn't know where to run. There was no cover around him, only forest and darkness. "You said you weren't afraid of us," one of the men said, picking up a rock. "We just want you to learn to respect." John couldn't believe what was happening. His pride vanished like smoke. "Please, I don't want any trouble," he shouted, but his words only caused more laughter. "It's funny to hear you say that," the second man said with a wink. "You've hated us all your life. Why should we give you a chance?" John thrashed about, looking for a way out, but the feeling of hopelessness grew. He began to realize that his prejudices, of which he had been proud, were now being turned against him. Fear took hold of him, and he felt rage rising within him. "I will change," he cried, but his voice was weak. I was wrong." "That's not true," one of the men said, approaching. "You're just afraid you'll get what you deserve." John felt his pride burn away, and in that moment he realized the absurdity of his situation. His life could end here, in this dark forest, and he realized that the only reason for his troubles was his own attitude towards people. The men began to approach, and John thought about how often he had looked down on people, how often he had despised those who were different. Now he himself had become a victim of his own prejudices. "Let's show him what it's like to be like him," one of them said, and there was a coldness in his voice. John closed his eyes and braced himself. He knew that if he didn't show determination, this could be the end. Suddenly, he saw a branch lying nearby and quickly grabbed it, lifting it above his head. "Get your hands off me," he shouted, trying to appear confident, although panic was raging inside him. The men stopped, surprised by his courage, but it didn't take the fear out of his eyes. "I'm not going to give up." But at that moment, John felt his own words ring hollow. He knew his chances of survival were fading before his eyes. The fear of imminent reprisal filled him, and he didn't know how to get out of the situation alive. John was faced with a choice: fight for his life or surrender, but deep down he knew that time was running out on his side. John stood at the edge of his world, hugging the branch as his last chance at survival. The men froze, their faces twisted in mockery, but in their eyes John saw something else, an evil satisfaction. They were enjoying his fear, and this knowledge only increased his horror. "You thought you could just run away, didn't you?" one of them said, stepping closer, his voice full of contempt. "You're alone now, and this is just the beginning." John glanced around nervously, assessing the situation. Behind him was the river, and ahead was a group of men who clearly weren't going to back down. He knew that if he didn't show resolve, the worst would happen to him. "I'm not like that anymore," he screamed, although deep down he didn't believe his words. I'll change." But this only provoked laughter. One of the men, tall and muscular, stepped forward. "Change? Who will believe you? You have looked down on people like us all your life. Now it's time to pay for your words." John felt his anger mingle with fear. He hadn't intended to be a victim, but the reality was washing over him like a dark wave. His legs were buckling, but he held on with all his might, clutching the branch tighter. "I'm not going to give up," he shouted, though his inner voice whispered hopelessness. The man closest to him just chuckled. "Give up? You already gave up when you started to hate," he said, approaching. "We only teach you what you yourself taught others." John thrashed about, looking for a way out, but the feeling of hopelessness grew. He began to realize that his prejudices, of which he had been proud, were now being turned against him. Fear took hold of him, and he felt rage rising within him. "I will change," he cried, but his voice sounded weak. "I was wrong." "That's not true," one of the men said, approaching. "You're just afraid you'll get what you deserve." John felt his pride burn away, and in that moment he realized the absurdity of his situation. His life could end here, in this dark forest, and he realized that the only reason for his troubles was his own attitude towards people. The men began to approach, and John thought about how often he had looked down on people, how often he had despised those who were different. Now he himself had become a victim of his own prejudices. "Let's show him what it's like to be like him," one of them said, and there was a coldness in his voice. John closed his eyes and braced himself. He knew that if he didn't show determination, this could be the end. Suddenly, he saw a branch lying nearby and quickly grabbed it, lifting it above his head. "Get your hands off me!" he screamed, trying to suppress his fear, although panic was raging inside him. The men stopped, surprised by his courage, but it didn't take the fear out of his eyes. "I'm not going to stay here," he said, and suddenly he realized that this was no longer just a fight for survival. This was an opportunity to realize his mistakes. But at that moment, John felt his own words ring hollow. He knew his chances of survival were fading before his eyes. The fear of imminent reprisal filled him, and he didn't know how to get out of the situation alive. John was faced with a choice: fight for his life or surrender, but deep down he knew that time was running out on his side. John clutched the branch, his hands shaking with fear and rage. He stood at the edge of his precipice, surrounded by men who looked like predators ready to tear their prey apart. Every step they took brought him closer to the inevitable, and he felt the tension building inside him. "You thought you could just walk away from your words?" one of the men said, his voice low and grim. "We won't leave you alone." John gritted his teeth, his mind racing with thoughts of how he had always judged others, how he had always chosen hatred over understanding. Suddenly he realized that these men weren't just his enemies, they were a reflection of the hatred he had nurtured within himself. "I'm not like that anymore," he shouted again, although he didn't believe either himself or them. "I want to change my attitude." The men exchanged mocking glances, and laughter rang out in response. They seemed to enjoy his suffering. One of them, the one who seemed to be the leader, stepped forward. "Change? You don't believe yourself," he said, snorting dismissively. "You've always hated us. Now it's time to understand what fear is." John felt panic rising inside him. He thrashed about, looking for a way out, but every attempt to escape was thwarted by his own fears. He was caught between unbearable tension and an incessant threat. "We can help you learn," the leader continued, his voice growing increasingly sullen. "You wanted to know what it was like to be trapped, didn't you?" The laughter of his accomplices sounded like a harbinger of trouble. John realized that they had power now, power over his fears, his inner demons. It was worse than physical violence. They were taking his soul. "What do you want from me?" he shouted, desperately trying to maintain some shred of dignity. "Just a little fun," one of the men replied, holding out his hand to John. "You always thought people like us weren't worthy of respect. Let's show you what that means." John, realizing they weren't going to let him go, began to run again. He didn't know where he was going, but his instinct for self-preservation took over. He tore through the trees, leaving behind laughter and screams, but he knew it was only temporary salvation. The men followed him, their voices growing closer. "You're not getting away," one of them shouted. "We'll find you wherever you go." John ran through the forest, feeling his strength fading. He tripped, falling to the ground, his heart pounding as if it would burst from his chest. He heard footsteps approaching and knew that time was running out. "We're close," came the laughter. "The game is just beginning." John rose to his feet, but he had no strength to continue. He knew they were playing with him, and his fear was becoming his own enemy. In that moment, he felt his own hatred had turned against him, and now he was in the deepest abyss. He glanced back, and for a moment his gaze met that of one of the men. In that gaze, John saw something he had not expected, not just hatred, but an understanding, perhaps, of the pain that they all shared. Suddenly, the realization pierced him, and he felt his fear give way to a strange understanding. "You don't understand," he said, his voice suddenly quiet. "I was wrong. I was always wrong." But the laughter only grew louder. "Too late for that, boy," one of them shouted, and John began to run again, not knowing where, but his heart now beating in unison with the knowledge that he himself had created this hatred. And when he tripped and fell again, he knew he couldn't go on like this, but now there was no way to change it. The darkness was growing around him, and he realized that the moment had come in his life when fear could turn into something even more frightening, his own exposure. John felt panic rising inside him as he staggered. Every step he took brought him closer to the edge of a precipice. Not a physical one, but a spiritual one. He felt like he was literally losing ground when footsteps came from the trees, and soon the men were right there. "You can't escape us," one of them shouted, his voice an ominous rumble. "We're here to teach you a lesson." John's heart was pounding, as if it was trying to escape from his chest. He knew he couldn't hide for long. The trees around him had grown dangerously tall, and fear was gripping him. Suddenly he saw a cliff ahead of him, and beyond it a dark abyss stretched out. "Watch where you're running," one of the men shouted, laughing as John spotted the edge. At that moment he stopped, his breath caught in his throat. He heard laughter behind him, and he realized that his pursuers were close. Too close. He stared into the abyss and felt despair creeping up on him. How had he ended up in this place? How could he have been so blind to his own prejudices? "You hated us, didn't you?" one of the men said, stepping closer. "Now it's time to learn what it's like to be afraid." John turned around and his eyes met cold, merciless ones. He knew he was standing on the edge of not only a physical cliff, but a moral one as well. A sense of hopelessness was growing inside him. "Please," he cried, his voice shaking, "I don't want to die." But the men only laughed, and their laughter sounded like a death sentence. One of them stepped closer, his face distorted with hatred. "We're here to show you what it's like to be vulnerable. You spent your whole life despising us, and now you're a victim of your own words." John was thrashing about, but he didn't know where to go. His back was pressed against the edge of the cliff, and he knew that behind him was an abyss, and in front of him was hatred, ready to devour him. His mind was filled with thoughts of how often he looked down on people, how he looked down on them, and now it was coming back to him. "You think your biases have no consequences?" one of the men said, approaching. "We will show you what fear is, what true vulnerability is." At that moment, John felt his inner world begin to crumble. He was on the verge of death, and he had no more time left. "I was wrong," he whispered, full of despair. "I didn't mean to offend anyone." But these words only caused more laughter. The men, seeing his weakness, began to approach, their faces shining with joy, as if they were about to receive their reward. "Forget about pity," one of them shouted. "Now you are just a toy in our hands." John darted back again, but he inadvertently stepped too close to the edge. In that moment, he lost his balance and, feeling the ground slipping away from under his feet, he screamed. He fell into the void, and only the cold wind in his face reminded him that he was still alive. But his fall stopped at the very edge of the cliff. As he clutched the roots of a tree, trying to hold on, fear filled his soul as he realized that he had no strength to rise, and his whole life had been reduced to this terrible moment. "You said you weren't afraid," one of the men shouted, leaning over him like a predator about to strike the final blow. "How do you feel now, John?" John hung over the abyss, and at that moment all his prejudices, all the hatred he felt, suddenly turned against him. He realized that hatred could not save him, that only the recognition of his mistakes could give him a chance for salvation. I understand," he said, pain in his voice. "I was wrong." But his words were ignored. The men looked at him as if he were a victim, ready to be killed. They enjoyed his fear, his vulnerability, and in that moment John realized that his life was in the hands of those he once despised. As if time had stopped, and he was on the brink of not only physical death, but spiritual death as well. He now realized that his hatred had led him to this terrible situation, and he knew that the only way to change his fate was to admit his mistakes. But time was running out, and every moment brought him closer to the edge. John, hanging over the abyss, felt his hands begin to tremble. The earth beneath him, the roots he held onto, seemed his last hope. He looked up at the men who were looking down at him with contempt, and in their eyes he saw not only hatred, but also a ruthless satisfaction. "You thought you'd always be on top, didn't you?" the leader said, his voice like a cold wind. "Now you can see what it's like to be down there." John closed his eyes, desperately trying not to fall. Memories of all the times he had let his hatred get the better of him flashed through his mind. He remembered the people he had humiliated, and he realized that he was now the victim of his own contempt. "I didn't want to live like this," he screamed, fear taking hold of him. I didn't know how painful it was. But his screams only caused more laughter. The men leaned closer, enjoying his suffering. "You don't know what pain is, John," one of them shouted. "We'll show you real pain." John's heart was pounding, and he could feel the roots beneath his hands beginning to weaken. He was on the verge of falling, and every moment was bringing him closer to the inevitable. He was beginning to realize that this was not just a physical confrontation, but a retribution for all his hatred. "Please," he breathed, desperation clenching his chest. "Give me a chance." But their faces only filled with greed for his fear. They relished his vulnerability, and he realized that no words would change their minds. "You don't deserve a chance," one of them said, leaning down to look him in the eye. "You're a product of your own prejudices." John felt his grip weaken. He was about to give in, but a new understanding flashed through his mind. He suddenly remembered the people he had once despised, and he thought that they, too, had been victims of a system that inspired hatred. "I can change this," he said, though his voice trembled. "I can do something good." But the men just grinned. They weren't taking him seriously anymore. John realized that this moment wasn't just about saving him, it was about changing his fate. He squeezed the branch one last time, feeling its strength weaken, but instead of giving in to fear, he focused on remembering his life. He remembered his mistakes, how hatred had blinded him. In that moment, he made a decision: if he was going to leave, at least he would do so with the knowledge of his mistakes. "I'm sorry," he said, looking at the men. "I was wrong, and I want to change that." And although his words seemed to fly into the void, they were sincere. He understood that this could not bring him back to life, but at least it would open the eyes of others. Suddenly John felt the roots beneath him begin to crack, and he groaned sharply. Looking down, he was on the verge of falling, and fear clenched in his chest. "Look how he's trying to survive," one of the men shouted, laughing. "But this is only the beginning." At that moment, John felt a clarity dawn on his mind. He realized that he could and must fight not only for his life, but for his right to be better than he was. "I don't want to die here," he screamed, and this scream sounded like a plea, like a last chance for salvation. But all he heard in response was laughter echoing through the forest. He began to realize that this might be his last chance to make a difference, not just in his own life, but in the lives of others. With an effort, he raised himself up on his hands, realizing that his strength was running out, but he could not allow himself to give in. He had to show courage, even if it cost him his life. He decided that he would fight until his last breath. At that moment, he felt his mind filling with new thoughts. He began to realize that hatred could not save him, and the only way to change his fate was to admit his mistakes and fight for the best. But could he do it before it was too late? John, hanging over the abyss, knew his strength was running out. Suddenly, a noise came from the trees. The men's screams died away as they turned their heads in the direction of the sounds. John, trying to concentrate, saw a group of people approaching them. They were dressed in uniforms, and on their chests glowed the insignia of a human rights organization. "What's going on here?" one of the women shouted loudly, her voice confident and commanding. It was Sarah, an activist known for her fight for human rights. Her friend Layla, also an activist, stood nearby, ready to intervene. The men standing around John froze, not expecting any intervention. They exchanged puzzled glances, unsure how to react to the sudden appearance of new players. "We've come in response to a signal of conflict," Sarah continued, her eyes sparkling with determination. "Get your hands off him." John felt his heart beat faster as he realized that perhaps his salvation was still possible. He fought to stay on the edge, and as he looked at Sarah and Layla, he felt hope ignite in his soul. "It's none of your business," the leader of the group of men said with disdain, his face twisted with anger. "We're just teaching him a lesson." "A lesson in hatred?" Sarah replied, not backing down. "You think that threatening a person's life is a solution? Your hatred will not save you from yourselves." John, hanging over the edge, felt his grip on the tree roots weakening again. He knew he had little time, and now his life depended not only on himself, but on the actions of Sarah and Layla. "Hang in there, John," Layla called, her voice encouraging. "We'll help you." At that moment, one of the men, ignoring the threat, stepped towards Sarah and Layla, trying to intimidate them. "Get out while you're still in one piece. We're not joking." But Sarah didn't back down. She looked into John's eyes and saw his fear, his despair. "You have to fight, John. We're here." Suddenly John realized he had a chance not just to save himself, but to change his life. He looked up at the men who were about to destroy him, and in that moment, courage began to rise inside him. "I will not be a victim," he screamed, his voice a curse on the hatred he had created. He jerked upward, trying to get to his feet. The men were confused. They had not expected John, whom they had thought broken, to be able to resist. One of them, the one closest, tried to grab him, but John, gathering all his remaining strength, jumped back, grabbing onto the branches of the trees. Sarah and Layla took advantage of the moment, running towards him. "Hold on tight," Sarah cried, holding out her hand. John grabbed her wrist, and in that moment he felt a support and strength he hadn't realized he had before. "We won't let you fall," Layla added, her eyes shining with determination. John, realizing that his hatred and prejudice had brought him to this point, began to focus on the fact that he could change his fate. He was on the brink, but now his life depended not only on him, but also on the support of his new friends. "Get away!" the leader of the group shouted again, angrily rushing at Sarah and Layla, but they did not give in. Sarah stepped forward. "We stand for justice, and you cannot intimidate us." John's blood boiled as he saw his new friends ready to fight for him. He knew that this was not just a battle for his life, but to free himself from the shackles of hatred that he had imposed on himself. "I'm not going to be who I was," he screamed, and with all his strength he tore himself free. He stood before the men with Sarah and Layla, his heart filled with determination. "We are together," he said, and now his voice sounded confident. The men, realizing that John was not alone, began to waver. They had not expected their victim to stand up to them with such courage. At that moment, John realized that hatred could be conquered and his life could be changed. "We all deserve a second chance," he said, looking his pursuers in the eyes. "But if you want to continue this hatred, you'll have to face us all." Now that his support was close by, John was ready to fight for his life and for the changes he needed. John, standing shoulder to shoulder with Sarah and Layla, felt a new fire ignite in his chest. He was no longer alone, and that gave him strength. The tension between the two groups was rising, the air filled with the anticipation of battle. The men surrounding John began to form a group, their faces contorted with anger. The leader, seeing that John was not going to give in, turned to his accomplices and said, "These women don't matter. They won't stop us." Sarah, not backing down, said, "Hate only makes hate stronger. You can't just take a person's life and think that will solve your problems." Layla nodded, her voice full of determination. "We are all victims of this hatred, but we are here to say, it must stop." John, still holding Sarah's hand, felt his own heartbeat in unison with their words. He was not only fighting for his life, but to change his fate, and perhaps the fates of others. The situation was heating up. The men looked at them as if they were a threat. One of them, a short man with tattoos, stepped forward, clenching his fists. "You don't understand who you're dealing with," he said, grinning evilly. "We won't stop until he pays for his words." John felt the fear rising inside him again, but in that moment he remembered how he had let hatred define him all these years. He decided he would no longer be a victim. He looked at Sarah and Layla, and saw support in their eyes. "I don't want to hate anymore," he said, his voice resolute. "I want to understand and change." The leader of the group of men chuckled. "Understand? This is ridiculous. You always thought that people like us are not worthy of respect." "It was my mistake," John replied, feeling his throat dry with emotion. "I was blind, but now I see that hatred is a vicious circle, and I don't want to be in it anymore." The men froze, as if they had been struck by his words. Suddenly one of them, the one who had been standing up, clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white. "You think you can just walk away from this? You have to pay." But this time John felt no fear. He knew his support was stronger. "No," he said, his voice hard. "I'm not going to pay. I'm going to live." Sarah took a step forward, her eyes blazing with determination. "We won't let you continue this. You must understand that hatred will not solve anything." Layla, feeling supported, added, "We can work on change. Together we can begin the healing process." One of the men seemed to think about it, but the leader of the group only grinned evilly when he saw some of his men wavering. "We cannot give up," he said, his voice a threat. "They are weak, and we will make them pay." John felt the tension building inside him, but he knew he couldn't let fear get the better of him. He looked into the men's eyes, and in that moment something new arose in his heart, not hatred, but hope. "If you want to continue this hatred, that's your business," he said, trying to sound confident, "but we're not going to fight you. We want to show that another way is possible." The leader of the group stood still for a moment, confused. John used the time to take a deep breath and collect his thoughts. He knew that change would not happen overnight, but he was willing to fight for it. Sarah, seeing the confusion, added, "Understand that hatred only creates more hatred. Let's choose the path of understanding and healing together." At this time, the sounds of approaching footsteps were heard in the forest. John and his friends turned their heads in the direction of the noise and saw several more people crawling out from behind the trees. These were activists who had come to help. "We heard the noise and came to support you," one of them shouted, running closer. "We won't leave you in trouble." Things were starting to change. John felt a wave of hope creep into his heart. He was no longer alone. They were part of something bigger now, and the hatred of those men no longer had power. The leader of the group of men, seeing the reinforcements, began to get nervous. "We're not going to stay here," he said, rubbing his hands as if trying to calm his growing excitement. "We'll leave, but remember, you're still not safe." Sarah, Layla, and the other activists stood next to John, and he felt them becoming a united force. "We will fight for justice," she shouted, "and you won't be able to intimidate us anymore." The men began to retreat, but they did not give in. They knew they had lost the battle, but the hatred in their hearts remained. As the last of them disappeared into the woods, John, still shaking from the experience, looked at Sarah and Layla. "Thank you," he said, his voice full of sincerity. "I can never forget this." "This is just the beginning," Layla replied, her eyes shining with hope. "We have to continue, and that means we have to work together." John nodded, realizing that his life would change now. He knew he had a long way to go to make up for his mistakes, but now he had support and was ready to fight not only for his life, but to change himself and society. John, Sarah, and Layla stood among the trees where the conflict had just occurred. The air was still tense, but now there was a sense of hope. They knew that this day had been a turning point not only in John's life, but in the fight against hatred and prejudice. "We have to meet the others," Sarah said, her voice determined. "This isn't just about John, this is about showing that hatred has no power when we are united." Layla nodded, her eyes burning with passion. "Yes, we should organize a meeting to discuss how to continue our fight. We can create a support group for those who face prejudice and hatred." John, still reeling from the experience, began to realize how important this initiative had been. He felt that he was no longer just a victim of his own prejudices, but part of something greater. "I want to help," he said, his voice growing more confident. "I want to tell my story so others can see that hate doesn't solve problems." Sarah smiled encouragingly. "That's exactly what we need. Your words can inspire others." They began to discuss plans to gather people ready for change. John felt his enthusiasm growing. He was no longer afraid. He wanted to change his life and the lives of others. A few days passed, and the local park was filled with people, human rights activists, and those who had once suffered from prejudice. The atmosphere was filled with anticipation and hope. John stood on a makeshift platform, his heart pounding with excitement. He looked around at the faces around him and saw the support in their eyes. "Hello everyone," he began, trying to sound confident. "I'm John, and I'm here to tell you my story." He spoke about how his life had been filled with hatred and prejudice, how he had put people down simply because of the color of their skin. He spoke about the fear that gripped him when he was on the edge, and how meeting Sarah and Layla changed his perception. "I realized that hatred does not give strength, it only destroys," he said, feeling his words reach the hearts of his listeners. "We can choose another path, the path of understanding and support." Among the crowd, he noticed a familiar face. It was a black woman he had once humiliated. There was no hatred in her eyes, only understanding and forgiveness. It touched him deeply. "I want everyone to understand that we are not alone," John continued. "Together, we can change this hatred into respect and love." The crowd, listening to him, began to show support. People began to applaud, and John felt a warmth spread through his body. He knew this was only the beginning. After the talk, John, Sarah, and Layla discussed how to take their ideas further. They decided to create a program where they could meet, share experiences, and help others who are experiencing bias. We need people to know there is a place where they can be heard. Sarah said, we can organize support groups and educational workshops. I can tell my story in schools. John added enthusiastically, we can show children how important it is to understand and accept each other. Their plans began to take shape, and John, feeling part of something bigger, knew his life would never be the same again. He was ready to work on his past and help others overcome their biases. After a few weeks, the program was up and running, and they began holding meetings. People came to share their stories, and John, encouraged by the success, continued to share his experiences. Each time, he felt the hatred go away and understanding take its place. One day, during one of the meetings, he noticed a new participant. It was a man with a sullen expression. He came with obvious mistrust and caution. John, seeing this, decided to approach him after the meeting. "Hi, I'm John," he said, extending his hand. "You're not alone, and I'm here to support you." The man hesitated, but then shook John's hand. "I'm Ben. I don't know if I'll ever understand." John nodded, understanding his feelings. "It's okay. It's a process. I started out hating myself, but I'm here to show that change is possible." Thus began a new chapter in John's life. Every time he met someone who felt fear and mistrust, he would use his own lessons to help them find a path to understanding. He understood that the fight against hatred was not just his personal battle, but a common one, and he was willing to dedicate himself to that goal. Each new encounter, each new face in the group reminded him of how important understanding and support are in this world where hatred and prejudice still exist. And although the road was long, John was determined to move forward, step by step, with hope in his heart. John continued his journey, working to change himself and those around him. His support group became a place for people to share their experiences and find comfort. However, deep down, John still felt that he needed to atone for his past mistakes, and he began actively seeking ways to do so. One day, after one of the meetings, he noticed that new faces had started to appear in the group. Among them a young woman named Kim, who was telling about her experiences with racism. Her story was filled with pain and despair, and John could not leave her without support. "You're not alone," he said, approaching her after the meeting. "I know how hard this is to go through. We're all here to help each other." Kim thanked him with a small smile, and they began talking about the importance of supporting each other in difficult situations. John felt that his own experiences served as an example, and this gave him strength. Several weeks passed and John continued to work on his program, but one day, as he was returning from another meeting, his life suddenly changed. He was walking through a park when he noticed a group of men discussing something in the corner. Suddenly, one of them, who seemed to be the leader, began to gain momentum in his speech, expressing obvious prejudice and hatred towards blacks. John, recognizing the voice, realized that these were his old acquaintances, the same men who had once threatened him. Suddenly he felt uneasy. He tried to pass by, but then one of the men noticed him. "Look who's here," he shouted, raising his hand to stop John. "Are you still with those noble friends?" The stream of hatred from their mouths washed over him, and John, feeling trapped, stopped. He knew he couldn't just ignore it, but at the same time, fear was growing inside him. "I'm not here to argue with you," he said, trying to remain calm. "I've changed, and I hope you can too." "Changed?" The group leader chuckled. "This is funny. We always knew you were a weakling." The situation was getting tense, and John realized that his old acquaintances were extremely aggressive. They began to approach him, and he felt the panic growing. Suddenly, a man John hadn't expected to see walked up to the stage. It was Kevin, a black man he had met at one of the meetings. Kevin was tall and muscular, and his confidence radiated. "Leave him alone," he said, stepping confidently between John and the men. "He's here to change his life, and you have no right to touch him." The group leader grinned and stepped towards Kevin. "And what will you do? You're just a blind victim of the system." Kevin, without retreating, replied, "I am not a blind victim. I am a man who knows what hatred is, and I have chosen the path of understanding, and you will not be able to break John, as you have broken others." The situation was heating up. John, looking at Kevin, felt a strength growing inside him. He remembered how his hatred had brought him to this moment. and now that he saw Kevin protecting him, a spark of hope ignited in him. "We can all change," John said, addressing the group of men. "Hate only destroys. I've been in your shoes, and I know what it's like, but I choose a different path, and you can do the same." The leader of the group froze as he saw John and Kevin standing shoulder to shoulder, ready to fight for their beliefs. He felt himself losing control of the situation. "You're just a coward," he hissed, starting to retreat. "We'll meet again." As if in response to his threat, Kevin, remaining where he was, said, "And we'll be ready for it. We'll be here to help each other." As the group of men turned and walked away, John felt a new hope ignite within him. He looked at Kevin, his heart filling with gratitude. "Thank you for coming," he said, trying to pull himself together. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Kevin smiled and replied, "We're here to support each other. This isn't just your fight, this is our fight." And in that moment, John realized that his journey to healing was just beginning. He was no longer alone, and together with Kevin and the others, they could overcome the hatred they had once created. John and Kevin stood in the park, the air still tense from their recent confrontation. The feeling of unity and support between them only grew stronger. John knew his path to redemption was just beginning, and now he had a reliable ally. "We need to talk to the others," Kevin said, looking at the group of activists who were still nearby. "We can't let this hatred come back." John nodded. They headed toward the rest of their group, where people were already gathering to discuss next steps. The atmosphere was tense, but there was also hope in the air. "Guys," Kevin began as they approached the group, "we just came face to face with hatred, but that shouldn't stop us. On the contrary, we should unite even more." Layla, listening to him, raised her hand. "I agree. This incident shows how important it is for us to work together. We must prepare for what may happen again." "Yes, and not just for us, but for anyone who experiences racism and hatred," John added. He felt his voice grow confident. "We can organize information sessions to teach people how to stand up to hatred." The discussion continued, and soon they came to the decision to create special events where people could share their stories, discuss problems, and find solutions. Each of them was ready to work on this task, and John felt that his life finally had meaning. Meanwhile, the group of men who had recently threatened John and Kevin had gathered in their hideout. The leader, still furious, was making a choice that could affect the fate of their entire group. "We can't let them win," he shouted, looking around at his accomplices. "They think they can just shrug off our hatred like it's nothing. But they're getting stronger," one of the men said, his voice shaking. "They're gathering people. We can't handle this if they work together." The leader chuckled, but his smile was full of malice. "Then we must strike. If they want to fight, then we must show that hatred is what will destroy them." The next day, John and his team held a meeting to discuss the details of the upcoming events. With each new idea, John felt his confidence grow. He knew he had support, and this gave him strength. However, as they began to organize their activities, John noticed that strange things were happening around them. People he knew and worked with were receiving threats. Some were even finding offensive notes on their doors. The atmosphere was getting tense. "This isn't just a coincidence," Layla said as they discussed what had happened. "This is a sign that someone is trying to scare us." Kevin nodded from the side. "We need to be careful. If they're going to take extreme measures, we need to be prepared." John felt fear begin to rear its head, but at the same time, he knew he couldn't let hatred break them. "We have to keep going," he said with determination. "We can't let them win." Meanwhile, a group of men, deeply dissatisfied, were formulating a plan of action. They decided that they would stage provocations at John's events to intimidate him and anyone else who joined his cause. "We need to act quickly," the leader said, looking at his accomplices. "We need to intervene at the next meeting and show them that they have no right to do this." Back with John and his team, they continued to prepare for the event. At the last minute, John decided they needed more security. They created a plan to monitor what was going on around them and make sure everyone felt safe. The day of the event arrived and John, Sarah, Layla and Kevin were getting ready to greet the participants. John stood on stage as people began to gather around him. He could feel his heart pounding, but he knew this was his chance to change not only himself but others as well. As the first group of participants entered the room, John saw them smiling, supporting each other. It gave him strength, but at the same time, he was worried that a group of men could still interfere. At that moment, he heard a loud noise outside. John and his team looked at each other, and there was alarm in their eyes. Shouts and laughter could be heard. They went outside and saw several men they had seen earlier heading towards the building. "It's them," Layla shouted, pointing at the approaching men. John knew that this was the moment. This was their moment of confrontation, and he was ready to stand up for his new life, his new family, built on understanding and love. John and his team stood in front of the building, watching the group of men approach, and the tension in the air was almost palpable. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but in that moment, he also felt a surge of determination. "We can't let them intimidate us," Kevin said, stepping forward, ready to defend himself. "We're here to make a difference, and we're going to stand up for each other." Layla, putting her arm around John's shoulder, added, "Let's make sure they know we're not alone. We have support." Sarah, standing next to him, looked at John. "Are you ready, John? This is your chance to show that you've changed." John nodded, although his internal struggle was still going on. He knew he had to act to show everyone that hatred could not break them. As the group of men approached, their leaders began shouting insults. They were clearly in an aggressive mood. "Look who's come," one of them shouted, pointing at John. "You must have forgotten who you really are." John, feeling anger and fear intertwining inside, stepped forward. "I'm here to show that hate doesn't win. I've chosen a different path." His words hung in the air, but to his surprise, the crowd that had gathered around him began to cheer him on. People began to applaud and shout, "Yes!" The situation was getting tense. The leader of the group, seeing that his attempt at intimidation was failing, began to shout even louder, "You shouldn't have come here. You're just puppets." But John, feeling the support of his friends and those present, continued, "We are here to resist hatred. We are the force that can change this world." Kevin stepped next to him, and at that moment the rest of their group joined in. It created a powerful unity that filled the space around them. "Together we can do more than any of us can do separately," Kevin said. "Hate has never won and never will." People around them started raising their hands, supporting their words. A group of men, realizing that they were losing control of the situation, took a step back, frozen in surprise. But suddenly one of the men, feeling that everything was getting out of control, decided to act. He rushed towards John and Kevin with clenched fists. John instinctively stepped aside and saw Kevin suddenly reach out and stop the attacker before he could strike. This led to a bit of chaos as the other men began to close in, but the crowd that had gathered around them refused to back down. "Stop!" John shouted, his voice confident. "This is not the way. We must not stoop to their level." Despite the raging emotions, there were shouts of agreement from the crowd. Some people began to encourage and cheer each other on. "Hate doesn't solve anything," Layla shouted, standing next to John. "Instead, we can unite and build a future." Suddenly, a girl appeared in the crowd with a poster that read, "Love will conquer hate." Her words and actions had a powerful effect. A wave of support and solidarity grew. The leader of the group of men, seeing that the situation was getting out of control, stepped back and said, "You think you can stop this? We're not leaving." But John, gathering his strength, looked straight into the eyes of his offender. "We are not afraid of you. We are not going to live in fear. Each of us has the right to safety and happiness, and we will fight for it together." The crowd exploded with applause and cries of support. At that moment, John felt all his worries and fears recede. He was not alone. He was surrounded by like-minded people, and together they could overcome any obstacles. Suddenly, the sound of sirens could be heard in the crowd. It was the police. They had arrived to break up the conflict. When John and his team saw them, the excitement and tension began to subside. "We're here to help," one of the officers said, looking at both sides. "Please disperse and talk peacefully." John, seeing that the situation could develop into an even greater conflict, sighed. "Let's talk," he said, heading towards the police. "We can resolve this peacefully." The police, encouraged by his words, looked at each other and nodded. Everyone began to calm down. At that moment, John realized that his efforts, the support of his friends and his willingness to fight for the truth could really make a difference. Gradually, Everyone began to disperse, and this conflict seemed to have ended. But for John, this was just a new chapter in his life, the struggle for understanding and resistance to hatred. Now, knowing that he was not alone, he was ready to continue his path, uniting people and developing dialogue. So a new era began, and John knew he had a lot of work ahead of him. But with Kevin, Layla, and other like-minded people, they were ready to tackle any challenges that came their way. After the tense situation in the park was resolved, John felt like his life had changed forever. He knew he had support now, and that gave him the strength to continue his fight. But there were still challenges ahead, and John knew they had to stay vigilant. A few days later, John's team met to discuss next steps. The atmosphere was filled with determination and energy, and they decided to organize a new event, a forum dedicated to combating racism and hate. John knew it would be a great opportunity to engage more people and create an open dialogue. "We need more participants," Layla said, looking up at the others. "Let's invite people from other communities to make this forum as diverse and inclusive as possible." Kevin nodded, supporting her idea. "We can use social media to spread the word. Let's make it so everyone can share their story." John took the initiative to organize the event. He felt that this was his chance not only to help others, but also to atone for his mistakes. In parallel with the preparation of the forum, he increasingly thought about how his past actions affected the lives of others. He wanted this event to become a symbol of change. Meanwhile, the group of men who had threatened John were not going to give in. They continued to discuss their plans, full of malice and hatred. "We can't just let them continue like this," the leader said, his voice full of rage. "They're laughing at us, and we have to show them that hatred is stronger than their friendship." One of the men nodded and added, "Maybe we can do some kind of provocation on their forum. It'll make them think." The leader chuckled. "That's a great idea. We can use this to fuel the hatred even more. We need to scare them and show them that they can't act with impunity." On the day of the forum, John was full of excitement. The venue was filled with people who had come to share their stories and hear from others. The atmosphere was friendly and everyone was in a positive mood. "Welcome, everyone," John began, standing on the stage. "We're here today to talk about how hate and prejudice are destroying our society, but we're also here to find ways to understand and support each other." The crowd applauded and John felt a surge of energy. He noticed Kevin and Layla in the audience and it gave him strength. The event began and participants shared their stories. One by one, they took to the stage to share their experiences with racism and how they dealt with bias. With each performance, the atmosphere became more and more filled with a spirit of unity. But suddenly, in the midst of the event, there was a noise outside the doors. John and the other participants exchanged glances. He felt the excitement sweeping through the crowd again. While the organizers were trying to sort out the situation, the doors suddenly burst open and a group of men familiar to John rushed in. The leader was leading his accomplices, and their faces expressed aggression. "What's going on here?" he shouted, bursting into the space. "You think you can gather here and spread your crazy ideas without consequences?" The crowd froze, shocked and confused. John felt his heart pounding. He knew this could turn into a serious conflict. "We are here to talk about understanding and love," he said, trying to remain calm. "You have no right to disrupt our meeting." The leader only chuckled. "Coming closer. Understanding and love? This is only weakness. Hatred is what drives people." Kevin, standing next to John, stepped forward. "We will not let you intimidate us. This is a place for dialogue, and we are not going to back down." But the group of men were not going to leave. One of them pulled out a flag from his pocket with an offensive message written on it. They began shouting hateful slogans, and the tension in the room grew. John realized that the situation was getting out of control. He decided to act. "Listen," he shouted, attracting the attention of everyone present. "We are here to be together, and hatred will not win. We must stand against this." His words caused the crowd to perk up a bit, and John noticed some of the participants starting to raise their hands in support. Kevin stood next to him. "If we stand together, no one can break us." At that moment, John saw that even among the men who had come with hatred, some were beginning to waver. This gave him hope. "You're not alone," John continued, addressing the group of men. "If you want to change your life, you can do it. We're here to help if you're ready to open up." Despite their fury, voices of doubt began to be heard among the men. This was the turning point. "We are here to build, not to destroy," John said, feeling his words reaching some of them. "You can choose another path." Finally, the leader of the group, seeing that his comrades were beginning to lose confidence, shouted, "Get out of our city." But now some of the men began to retreat, and John felt that the situation was beginning to turn in his favor. "We will stay," he said with determination, "and we will work together to create a society based on understanding and support." The crowd, full of hope and support, burst into applause again. John felt that his efforts had not been in vain, and now they could overcome this hatred together. This was their moment, the moment when hate did not win, but unity and love prevailed. John knew the fight was not over, but now he knew he was not alone. As the noise in the room died down and the participants began to realize that hatred had not broken them, John felt a surge of confidence. He knew that this was a turning point, and that they had a chance to change things for the better. "Let's talk," he said, looking at the men who had come with aggression. "Let's discuss why you feel hatred. We are all here to hear you." Some of the men hesitated, and John noticed that the leader of the group was clenching his fists, but his expression became less confident. "What do you suggest?" one of them asked, his voice sounding less aggressive. "We can have a discussion where everyone can share their experiences," John replied, feeling the team's support. "We can start a dialogue that will help us understand each other." The leader, clearly struggling with internal conflict, looked at his accomplices. He knew there were people in the room who were willing to compromise, but the hatred he harbored was deep. "We all want to talk to you," he said with a shadow of doubt in his voice. "These are all just words." "Perhaps," John replied, trying to remain calm, "but words can make a difference. Let's try. You can change your mind." The crowd began to actively support John, and in this powerful unity he felt the hatred begin to dissipate, but not everyone was ready to give up. "I'm for it," one of the men suddenly spoke up. "Let's try to talk. Maybe we'll learn something new." "This is a step forward," Kevin said, encouraging the others. "If you're willing to open up, maybe you'll see another side." At this point, the atmosphere in the room changed. The conversation became more constructive, and the participants began to exchange opinions. Some of those who came with hatred began to talk about their fears and disappointments. "I grew up in a place where hatred was the norm," one of the men admitted, his voice shaking. "I don't know how to be any different." John sensed this was a key moment. "We're all here to learn from each other," he said. "Each of us can change our perceptions." The forum continued, and over time, the men who had come with aggression began to open up. This led to honest conversations about racism, bias, and the pain they were experiencing. John felt the atmosphere gradually calm down. However, not everyone was happy. The leader of the group, unable to cope with the growing feeling of insecurity, began to lose control. He jumped up and shouted, "It's all a lie. You're all deceived." But his words no longer had the same force as before. The crowd gathered around him looked at him with pity and bewilderment. John, sensing that this might be their chance, stepped forward. "We will not allow hatred to rule our lives," he said with conviction. "We choose the path of understanding and support, and if you are ready, we will be happy to help you." The leader of the group froze, realizing that his comrades were beginning to drift away. Several men who had come with him began to look at John and his team with interest and hope. "Maybe it's really worth a try," one of them said, his voice quiet but confident. John, sensing an opportunity to change the situation, continued, "We can build a new community where everyone can feel safe, where hatred does not prevail. It is within our power." Support began to grow. The crowd that had once been afraid now stood together, ready for change. The leader of the group felt that he was losing support, and this seemed to be the turning point for him. I don't know what to do," he said, his voice shaking. "I just don't want to be weak." "Being strong means opening up," Kevin said, coming closer. "We can all make mistakes, but only together can we find the right path." This caused a murmur among the group. Some of the men began exchanging glances, and John saw the hatred give way to understanding. Suddenly, one of the men standing to the side stepped forward. "If you're ready to try, I'm ready. I'm tired of hatred." This was the turning point. The other men began to agree, and cheers went up from the room. The leader, feeling his power crumbling, began to retreat. "Perhaps I was wrong," he said, but there was despair in his voice. John saw an opportunity. "It's not too late," he said. "We can all change our views. Let's take a step forward together." The crowd echoed his words, and at that moment there was a sense of unity in the room. John knew it wasn't going to be an easy road, but now they had a chance to create something new. The forum continued, and each participant felt that this was not just a conversation, it was the beginning of changes that could affect their lives forever. As the evening ended and people began to leave, John felt they had taken an important step toward overcoming the hatred. He looked at his friends, Kevin, Layla, and saw them smiling at each other. They all knew this was just the beginning. It was a path to a new future, full of hope and change, and John was ready to walk it along with everyone else. As the forum drew to a close, John felt his confidence growing. He saw that even among those who had previously played the role of hate, changes were beginning to occur. But suddenly, a threat appeared on the horizon again. The leader of the group, who had previously tried to stir up hatred, suddenly returned to his accomplices. With bitterness and rage, he shouted, "We will not allow this to happen. We cannot leave them unpunished." The crowd was on guard again, and the tension in the air was growing. John noticed that several men who had come with hatred were beginning to gather around the leader, and this was alarming. He knew that the situation could escalate again. "Look!" the leader shouted, pointing at John. "He's a traitor. He's betrayed us for these people. Don't let him get away." John felt his heart pound. At that moment, when everything seemed hopeless, a man stepped out of the crowd, a black man named Michael, who had spoken at the forum a few days earlier. He was full of determination and confidence. "Enough," Michael said loudly, looking the group leader straight in the eye. "This is not the way. We came here to talk, not to quarrel." The leader, seeing Michael, froze for a moment, but then shouted again, "And you too? Are you for them?" "I'm for people," Michael replied, not looking away. "I'm for understanding, and you can't break that." The crowd was silent and waiting. John felt a surge of hope as he saw Michael rise to the defense. This was the decisive moment. "We don't want war," Michael continued, addressing everyone. "We want peace and dialogue. There should be a place for everyone in our community, regardless of skin color." Despite the threats from the haters, the crowd began to talk. People began to support Michael, and even those who had previously followed the leader began to come over to his side. "I'm tired of the hate," one of the men said, stepping away from the group. "We have a chance to change that. Let's do it together." At that moment, John felt the hatred actually begin to dissipate. The leader of the group, realizing that he was losing control, tried to scream, but his voice no longer sounded as convincing. "We won't leave," he said in despair, but his accomplices began to retreat. "Why?" Michael asked, his voice confident. "Why do you want to continue this cycle of hate? Does it make sense?" The men began to look at each other, and glimmers of doubt appeared among them. They began to understand that hatred only destroys, and that the desire for understanding could change their lives for the better. "Let's try," one of them finally said, and this became a signal for the others. As if on command, everyone gradually began to retreat from hatred and ascend to the path of understanding. John felt the tension ease. He walked over to Michael and they exchanged glances, a moment of unity. "Thank you," John said, realizing that Michael was the one who was able to help him and others in this difficult moment. "We all have to be here for each other," Michael replied. "This is our common fight." As everyone began to disperse, John felt they had taken an important step. The experience had shown that even in the darkest situations, it was possible to find light if people were willing to open up and work together. Even though the journey to understanding was just beginning, hope was born in John's heart. He knew that together with Michael and his team, they could overcome any obstacles and create a society free of hatred. From that day on, John became actively involved in programs aimed at strengthening ties between different communities. He realized that the fight against bias is not only a personal matter, but a common cause for all who strive for peace and understanding. Michael became his friend and ally, and together they continued their journey, inspiring change in others. Thus began a new era for their community, an era in which understanding and love triumphed over hatred and prejudice. John and Michael's story was over, but their impact was just beginning. Together, They continued to work on forums and educational programs, inspiring people to open dialogue and mutual understanding. Over time, their community changed dramatically. People began to come together, sharing their stories, supporting each other, and helping those who had not yet overcome their biases. Diversity became their strength, and unity their goal. John, who was once a prisoner of hatred, became a symbol of change. His own path to redemption inspired many, and he now understood that true strength lies not in dominance, but in the ability to listen and accept others as they are. With each new event, with each new story, their bonds grew stronger. A society once torn apart by hatred began to flourish in an atmosphere of love and understanding. John and Michael knew the road ahead would be difficult, but they weren't alone anymore. They were part of something bigger, a movement that was working toward peace and harmony, and every step they took together brought them closer to a brighter future. Thus, a story that began with hatred and prejudice ended in a spirit of unity and hope, and that was only the beginning. Thank you for being with us on this story. It's really important for us to know what you think about what's happening. Have you ever experienced racism in your life? How did you deal with such situations? Please share your thoughts in the comments. Your opinion is very valuable to us. Each of you is important, and we truly appreciate your support. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new content. Have a great day!